I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Electronic health records are a rich source of real-world data that can provide insights into health and wellness. Neal Meropol, head of research oncology at Flatiron Health, said they not only have value as a research tool for retrospective studies, but can be a treasure trove of information for prospective studies as well. We spoke to Meropol about how real-world evidence can inform better clinical trial designs and accelerate drug development, how Flatiron works with its clients, and a recent study he was involved in that suggests if drug developers want to increase the diversity of clinical trials participants, they should consider broadening inclusion criteria. Neal, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here, Dan.
We're going to talk about clinical trials in cancer, Flatiron Health, and how real-world evidence can inform better clinical trial designs and accelerate drug development. Perhaps we should begin with a definition for listeners. When you talk about real-world data, what does that include in the context of Flatiron Health, and is it limited to what's in an electronic health record?
So broadly speaking, real-world data are data that relate to patient health status or the delivery of healthcare that is routinely collected from a variety of sources. So examples of what I'm calling RWD include data arrived from electronic health records, but also other sources like medical claims, insurance claims, data from disease registries, or data gathered from other sources that are increasingly being used today, like digital devices, think of wearables, that can inform health status. And we've found that electronic health records, or EHRs, are a really rich source of RWD, both broad and deep. And as a digitized repository of clinical data that's used largely for communication as well as billing purposes, and I know we might get into that later, the EHR is a great source of information that allows you to chronicle the journey of every patient. And we at Flatiron are focused on the cancer patient journey. And that said, we found that we can provide enhanced evidence solutions by integrating information in the EHR with other data sources as well, like genomic information or digital images, think radiology images, claims data, and even mortality data, because believe it or not, while you think that if a patient dies, that will be captured with a date in the electronic health record, it may not be, and it commonly is not. And so we have to link with other external sources of data to have a complete patient journey. Over the past decade, we've really learned a lot about not only how to curate data from the EHR at scale, but also about clinician workflows that bear on the quality of data that are entered at the point of care. And, many folks don't realize that Flatiron's also an EHR vendor, and we therefore support a network of oncologists nationwide that actually are on the front lines providing care to patients. And this gives us a special sensitivity to not only the patient journey, but also the journey of a data point from the time when a clinician's having a discussion with a patient to its entry into the electronic record to its curation and ultimate disposition as part of a research data set. And this clinical sensitivity keeps us rooted in the concept that any research use of patient data, which is carefully de-identified, of course, is only being used to benefit patients, whether accelerating drug development, improving access to new therapies, or providing clinicians with decision support. And we like to think of this as using data for good. And And one final point about real world data before we move off is that it's really worth noting that real world data are not only relevant in conducting retrospective or observational research, but also in designing and streamlining prospective clinical trials. And especially as the field is recognizing the need to make clinical trials more pragmatic and look more and more like routine clinical care.
It's interesting that Flatiron Health is also an electronic health record vendor. These records were essentially designed for billing, not research. At the same time, there's enormous amounts of valuable data that could provide insights into illness, treatments, and outcomes. How well suited is it as a research tool? And as a vendor, have you done things differently to make it a better research tool?
This is just a really great question. You are so right that the design of electronic health records wasn't originally focused on research applications. And as a clinician, I can tell you that sometimes EHRs don't even feel like they've been optimized for clinical care. Sad but true. EHR vendors do get a bad rap. But now that I work for one, I realize that federal regulations and payer requirements may hamstring us to some extent. But that said, we really focus on the user. And if you take a user-focused design approach, that can really help us reimagine the EHR of the future. And that's how we approach our EHR customers, our users, in developing new ways of helping support their care of patients. Now, with all these caveats, EHRs are in fact a great source of information for research and quality improvement. So I'm totally bullish. My former colleagues in academia think I'm fairly insane when I tell them that I just love electronic health records. But in terms of the EHR as a research tool, it is a great platform for both retrospective and prospective studies. And the routinely collected data in the EHR is a true treasure trove of information that can provide insights on patients and to help patients. And so we leverage this information to automate patient matching for clinical trials. And we've developed tools for seamless entry of clinical trial information directly in the EHR, and also developed software for the transfer of clinical data directly from the EHR into study data systems. So it turns out that while a lot of people think of the EHR as a platform for conducting retrospective real-world data research, it can also be leveraged as a great platform for prospective studies as well.
It's been a little bit more than a decade since Flatiron launched. During that time, there have been a number of drivers that have helped fuel the use of real-world data. I'm thinking here not only of innovations in information technology and growing demand, but policy and the regulatory environment. What have been the major forces that are enabling greater use and integration of real-world data?
This one's really important, as in fact the planets have aligned in a sense to accelerate the adoption of real-world evidence as high-quality evidence. First, this started in a way back in 2009 with the HITECH Act, which incentivized the use of electronic health records. And after that act, there was rapid adoption to the point where today almost every patient is taken care of with the assistance of an electronic health record. And this provides not only a huge data source, but also one that's representative of all cancer patients. So that was 2009. Then in 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act charged the FDA to develop a framework for consideration of real-world evidence in their regulatory decision-making. And they initially published a guidance in 2018 to help folks like us who help provide solutions to evidence needs with the use of real-world data. And since that time, the FDA didn't stop in 2018. They've been really generous in publishing a series of guidances related to real world evidence, including how to use EHR data, what characteristics make it suitable for regulatory decision making, how to think about fitness for purpose and data quality, how to think about registries, and how to think about data from other digital sources. And it's not only the United States regulatory agencies, but international agencies and medical agencies and regulatory bodies like the EMA in Europe have also followed suit and published guidances on the appropriate use of real-world evidence.
One of the challenges that electronic health records pose is that they contain both structured and unstructured data. What does that pose for a challenge for you as a researcher?
So just to level set for the folks listening, structured data refer to data that are entered as discrete numerical values or categories, like lab tests or vital signs or dates that certain events take place, or patient demographics, things that might have a scroll down menu that you can click on one of the options or enter a number. And to take it from a system like an electronic health record and make it suitable to address a research question, even structured data need to go through a process of harmonization and normalization to a common data model before they're ready for analysis. Now, it would be great if all information in the health record was structured, but in fact, the majority is not structured. It comes in unstructured format, and the data that are unstructured are really important, in particular in understanding a cancer patient's clinical course. And so, what are some examples of unstructured documents? Physician notes, radiology and pathology reports, biomarker test results. Sometimes these are faxed in still, believe it or not, faxed to doctors' offices and then scanned into their electronic records so that they're accessible at the point of care. And the curation of this unstructured information is really complicated. Fortunately, we've developed methods to do this at scale that involve a combination of natural language processing, machine learning, and actually human abstractors. And when we use people for confirming certain data elements or reading certain aspects of the record, we also use technology to assist them and improve their efficiency in finding particular documents and sorting through the health records. Now, we've had a lot of success in using AI and ML to extract the unstructured data from the EHR and make this usable for research. And, as I noted before, it'd be great if all information was recorded at the point of care as structured data. And there's a lot of emphasis, a lot of talk about increasing the proportion of research critical information that would be structured. But in order to accomplish this, you need to make sure that you're taking the actual clinician workflow into account, because you can't add clicks to the world of a busy clinician whose main focus is taking care of their patients and providing high quality care, not about ensuring that the data they entered has a secondary use down the line.
As you think about the clinical development of new therapies, how can this real-world data inform what drug developers do and allow them to do it better? Can you walk us through various points along the way where it can provide benefits?
Sure. Real-world data and real-world evidence, which is taking real-world data and applying analytic methods to it to provide an insight. RWD and RWE have a place across every stage of the biopharma life cycle. So, for example, if you're talking early on in the discovery realm, clinicogenomic databases, that is taking clinical data and merging it with biologic data, genomic data, can help identify new targets and the relevance of those targets to diseases like cancer, and can also support research into predictive biomarkers and mechanisms of resistance to therapy. And then once you get into clinical development, RWD can provide clinical context for the results of single-arm studies and can also help with go, no-go decisions for biopharma companies based on the outcomes that are observed with real-world data with current standards of care. Real-world evidence has also served as supportive evidence in regulatory decisions in certain clinical contexts where a randomized study may not be feasible or to support a label expansion. And in later development, RWD can provide evidence-based support for clinical trial design and site selection. And we support sponsors in helping them design studies that are going to be most inclusive and most reflective of the underlying patient populations with cancer. And also by accessing data across a network of clinical sites that take part in research, you can help select sites for clinical trials that match the patient populations that they are seeing. And then finally, retrospective real-world evidence and prospective real-world studies can support post-marketing commitments and requirements in a regulatory setting. So we're really talking about, a broad distribution of potential benefits in terms of supporting clinical development.
There's been growing concern about the lack of diversity in clinical trial participants. In addition to your role with Flatiron Health, you're co-chair of the National Cancer Institute's Streamlining Clinical Trials Working Group. What's the problem with concerns about diversity in clinical trials?
Yeah, so you're right to call this out, because this really is a crisis of sorts. The fact that patients who take part in clinical trials are really very different than the overall patient population with cancer. They tend to be younger, more educated, they're generally healthier, richer, and frankly, they lack the racial diversity that characterizes our country right now. So the patients in clinical trials aren't representative of the underlying patients with cancer, and the results of these studies may therefore not be generalizable. I like to think of this as a societal imperative to fix this problem. So, how we're thinking about helping solve this is multi-pronged, but to a large extent, it's focused on improving patient access to clinical trials, all patients, wherever patients receive their care. And part of this is focused on making it more easy with less friction for sites that might not otherwise take part in research to adopt participating in clinical trials, such that clinical research becomes more and more aligned with routine clinical care and can be delivered wherever clinical care is delivered. So what are some of the initiatives I've been involved with? Well, you mentioned that I've been privileged to co-chair a working group for the National Cancer Institute called the Streamlining Clinical Trials Working Group, which had a charge to advise the NCI on ways to decrease the burden of data collection for clinical trial sites and for patients by extension. And in our report, which we published recently, this committee defined a bunch of data elements that are routinely collected but have limited value in terms of determining the safety and efficacy of drugs. And we made specific recommendations to the NCI to adopt these recommendations in NCI-sponsored clinical research studies. So for example, for drugs where there's already a lot known, but they're being studied in another context, why collect all the details related to mild side effects, which just adds a lot of burden to sites in terms of data collection? This working group also called out the potential for technology to automate the process of transferring clinical trial data from electronic health records to study databases. And in fact, much of the data that are necessary for clinical trials are already routinely collected and documented in the EHR. So this is an active area of work at Flatiron because we found that the burden of data collection is a major cost for sponsors and a major pain point for trial sites who have trouble maintaining high-quality research staff.
You were also involved in a recent study that looked at the effects of inclusion criteria, and it suggests that broadening inclusion criteria is one way to address this problem. Can you talk about how trial sponsors typically set inclusion criteria?
Sure. Believe it or not, sponsors often set inclusion criteria based on what they did in the last study. The so-called cut and paste from one clinical protocol to the next. And they might also ask expert advisors who are working with their own biases, perhaps. Or they might ask Dr. Smith, whose office is down the hall. In other words, the process isn't evidence-based all the time. And of course, I'm oversimplifying, but the fact is that because of the existence of real-world data that can be applied to understanding inclusion criteria and their impact on how many patients are available for a study, it's really changed how we think about designing studies. And so we hypothesized that strict inclusion criteria for clinical trials might disproportionately exclude older patients and patients of color, which, as I mentioned before, are historically underrepresented. And so what did we do? And we published this in the past month in the New England Journal of Medicine Evidence. We looked across hundreds of thousands of patients in the Flatiron database. And what we found is that by making small tweaks in eligibility criteria that made them less restrictive, for example, cutoffs for kidney or liver abnormalities, we were able to dramatically increase the number of eligible patients for typical studies across many types of cancer. So as an example, over 78% more patients were eligible for studies when we loosened common criteria. And these looser criteria disproportionately benefited older patients, Black patients, and patients with lower socioeconomic status. Exactly the same patients who are consistently underrepresented in clinical trials. So we now provide this service to biopharma partners in applying data instead of using habit or hearsay when they're designing their studies.
It's a fascinating finding. I'm wondering if, given that inclusion criteria can play such a critical role in the success and failure of an experimental therapy meeting its endpoint, whether there are risks in expanding inclusion criteria that would dissuade companies from doing so.
That's another great question, Dan. There's, of course, a concern that if you let sicker patients onto clinical trials, the results won't look as good. So we tested that hypothesis as well. And in fact, in some diseases, looser criteria were associated with a small decrease in survival, and in others there wasn't. So we therefore recommend that data-driven trade-offs need to be considered when designing a study. And we help our partners do this by providing data and analytics services. And so as an evidence solutions company, we offer bespoke solutions that could include data, analytics services, and software to automate clinical trials data collection or end-to-end clinical trial support even.
Well, let me ask you about Flatiron's business model. Does it operate as a software service model? Does it perform research on behalf of clients? What's the way it works with the people it serves?
Yeah. As I mentioned before, we're an evidence solutions company. So we run the gamut. So we provide analytics services when required, and we create data sets that are specifically designed to address a specific use case or a problem to be solved for a sponsor. And this might include generating data curated from existing data in electronic health records, or it could include standing up a prospective clinical trial to ensure that the data collected meet the needs of a sponsor that might go beyond what is possible with retrospective data.
You have a deep background as an academic researcher. What led you to turn to industry, and how do you find the research you do today compares to what you were able to do in an academic setting?
I love this one. Leaving academia wasn't an easy decision, as you might imagine. But at the time, I was looking for a new set of challenges and potential impact on a bigger scale. So I had a career in academia and joined Flatiron about 7 years ago now. So when I was thinking of my next adventure back in the day, I made a list, like I always do, of the things that were important to me. This included, helping cancer patients, leveraging data for research, and I really enjoy building teams and careers. So at the time, I'd been watching this startup called Flatiron, and it seemed aligned with my goals and vision, and so I made a cold call. And the rest is history. Here I am.
Neal Meropol, Vice President of Research Oncology at Flatiron Health. Neal, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Dan. Great talking with you.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.